All right, Hunter, thanks for being here today.
Absolutely.
We're going to talk about the Golden Guardians offseason. So by now, everyone knows the news. High is being replaced by Mickey. We've got some new additions to the academy team. X-Special's coming up to assistant coach. So I'll just dive right into the big one. Why is High leaving?
Yeah. Ultimately, I think what we needed to do is get a stronger laner in mid to free up the team to strategically play the game with more flexibility. So we had to funnel a lot of resources into kind of stabilizing mid and then try to play from mid out, which was a challenge ultimately. And even though we had strong laners in Lorlo and definitely in Matt in the bottom lane separately, we weren't able to necessarily take advantage of their strength. And we'd end up in games having lost relatively earlier in the mid game, or like early mid game, in sort of that mid jungle 2v2 struggle. And not, I think with Mickey in place, an LCS ready player who can step right in and be a strong laner with a gigantic champion pool, we have the strategic flexibility to play through mid, if that's what the match and the meta is asking for, play through top, play through bottom, really give ourselves the best opportunity to kind of see what each individual person can do, and let everybody continue to develop.
Mm-hmm. High had described it as he didn't play quite as a hard carry playstyle as the team needed. Is that how you would describe it?
No. Clearly we miscommunicated something along the way there. I think I know where High's going, right? He has a very supportive style, generally speaking, and where we had success this split, it was getting him onto Galio or Orianna champions that would let him roam and support the other lanes if they had gotten stronger. And so that is simply the case. He also has a bunch of intangibles that happen later in the game if you can get there and still be relevant, which sometimes we could and definitely sometimes we couldn't. We're not expecting Mickey to hard carry this team. It's not that we had 4 bad players and High wasn't good enough to turn that team into a success. I think it's that we have 4 good players, and now with Mickey in addition, we have 5 great players, and I think we'll be strong enough to win more games. Mickey, I think by laning strongly, gives us something different than we had before, and I think that should be much better for us.
So you've mentioned the specific note seems to be laning strongly, stronger laner. Do you mean someone who can apply more pressure, someone with a wider champion pool, or someone who just generally succeeds more in their lane matchup?
Yes, and I think the meta didn't move that much on mid over the course of the split in terms of what people were looking for. Definitely hard pushing and roaming is like a big part of what mid has been asked for. Mickey can do that, but I also think meta changes and flexibility at that position, just like for most of these positions, is critically important. It is hard to play enough games and get enough solo queue and scrim often enough to stay on top of the pace of League of Legends, generally speaking. Mickey is an incredibly hard worker and has shown over his time in League of Legends that he's flexible enough to adapt to whatever the current meta and his team needs. And so I think that'll be incredibly useful for us.
I think what the community worries most about is what is lost with High. Experience, leadership, shot calling ability, something that I don't think they believe Mickey has yet. How would you define Mickey's strengths outweighing all of those qualities?
Yeah, so I guess what I would answer it is, we know that High has a ton of leadership ability. It's natural in him and oozes out of him. That confidence is infectious, and it was good for our team to have it there. He's a singular voice, and he strides forward, and because of his sort of natural leadership skills, people follow him, and that's amazing to have, for sure. We're not expecting Mickey to replace that, right? This is not a one-to-one. As much as it is in terms of the lineup, it's not a one-to-one in sort of skills and expertise. We are creating a leadership vacuum intentionally, right? We know that that's what's happening, but nature reports a vacuum, and we're going to expect our sort of 5 players to fill that in a number of different ways. And we sort of prepared for this. We have a lengthy offseason, right? There are almost 3 months between our last game of Spring Split and our first game of Summer Split. So there's time for our players to adapt to sort of that new space in comms, in scrim reviews and other things, kind of new strategic flexibility, and see how they fill those roles. We're kind of looking at, we've sort of broken it down into 4 or 5 distinct things that High was doing, and we're asking each of our players to kind of take on an aspect of that. This is good for them, and it's good for us. Ultimately, we're a development-oriented organization, and to do that, our players need room to develop. High was so strong in some of these things that there wasn't space for these guys to try, maybe to fail, maybe to get better, maybe to be a natural success at that anyway. We're taking some risk in that sense, but we also think, having seen our guys for a full split and knowing them behind the scenes, they're ready to take on some of those leadership mantle or some of those leadership opportunities.
To pull up a quote from you, about some of the qualities of the Golden State Warriors that you really wanted to instill in Golden Guardians. Investment in talent, commitment to players that you find, building a style of play around the strengths of the players, believing in them and putting them in a position to succeed. So as you mold the team long term, what is the line between helping a player succeed and, in this case, where you decide you have to make a change?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, and this sounds simplistic, but we have to think of like the greater good, right? We're an organization broadly, and each player, like we are investing in 5 players at the LCS level, but the success of one can't come at the expense of the others. Or even the success of 2 can't come at the expense of the other 3. I think everybody has to compromise. Relationships are compromised in general, and this is a group of people coming together and trying to work together, and so that comes with sort of sacrifice and support and compromise. But for the team to succeed overall, each player has to be willing to put the team first, and we as the organization have to be willing to put the team ahead of any individual player when the time comes. So I think when we're looking and thinking about making changes, we want to see if we don't need to make a roster change or a personnel change, but the person has that kind of change that we're looking for in them, or they have the ability to kind of adapt or mold or sort of adjust into what we're looking for. And I think we would start there before we did anything more drastic, at least if we felt like that was possible. We had a lot of conversations about what to do with High, what other possibilities are, ways that we can leverage all of his strengths, minimizing some of his weaknesses, keep what we like within the team or within the organization, and ultimately this was just the right move for both sides.
You ever consider putting him in sort of a coaching position?
We did, and I guess what I would say is High is an excellent role model, but I don't think he's a natural mentor. His leadership skills are to do and to ask others to do with him. And I think one area where he struggled and where I think in a way we didn't hit our kind of paradigm that we set up is that his leadership style isn't necessarily one where you take a younger player and he teaches them things. He takes a younger player and tells them what to do. And if a younger player or a developing player can extract a lot of those lessons on their own, you can learn sort of through osmosis just by being around it. But if you're looking for a teacher, and I think in a lot of ways a coach in the League of Legends space is still very much a teacher, that's not necessarily what High does.
Did you expect High to be a teacher or a doer for the roster in-game?
I think a little bit of both. I think when we got to actual LCS games, it was sort of do and follow along. But there are a lot of non-LCS games. You do a lot of scrim and a lot of solo queue and duo queue, and there's a lot of other time. And I think we were disappointed. That's a little strong. I think we were surprised at how singular sort of High's nature was in that sense, and ultimately I think that's something that wasn't contributing as much to the development of the other 4 guys as it could have been.
Where does the development come from when most of the roster is a little young?
Yeah, so one thing we're talking about a lot this split is mutual accountability, right? So we're asking, I think all of our guys, and most League of Legends pros actually, are really good at pushing themselves. They grind a lot of games kind of naturally to get this far. They just have to be obsessed with League of Legends. And the scene is like really good at players being self-critical, right? After every game that people lose, they always tweet that they're disappointed to their fans, and they mean it, right? Like they feel all of those losses. What the industry or the system, the guys don't do necessarily a really good job of is supporting and pushing each other. Right? And so learning from each other, benefiting each other, asking each other for support. They're really good at analyzing their own weaknesses and getting in their own head, sometimes to the point where they sort of get down or they let Reddit tilt them or whatever. They don't necessarily do a good job of building each other up and asking each other for help. And I think that's something we're trying to add into the system that already has, like, we have coaches, there are people whose job is to like teach and mentor and grow, right, and facilitate conversations and other things. But we're asking our guys to kind of own their own development in a way that we didn't necessarily do last split. Ask each other for help. Ask somebody to duo queue. Don't let your teammates kind of silently fail you. If you think they need to work on something, you should tell them that. If you want to get in game with them and you want to sort of do top jungle duo queues and gank top a lot, or ignore top and play the other side of the map, but you think that's something they need to work on, you should ask them to do it. And if somebody asked you to do something, you should say yes and jump in wholeheartedly and help them, and help yourself. I think silently failing or letting your team, letting your company, letting your organization silently fail you is definitely something I've been guilty of in my past and something I've worked on in my professional career, and something that I'm now looking to these guys for them to improve on for the organization's growth overall.
You know, right now you have a majority of the old Team Liquid roster. Some people do not think that is a great thing.
Yeah. I guess what I would say is the old Team Liquid roster was around for one regular season weekend and then promotions. So I don't think that's really fair, but I answer that question somewhat the way I did when we signed Lorlo and Matt in the first place, right? Their 2 years at Team Liquid were about the most dysfunctional 2 years that have existed in League of Legends, at least for an organization that stayed around that full time. They had a strong spring split in their first split where I think they finished third or fourth. And then the breaking point split, and then they had the golden glue reign over, and then mid lit and double lifts come back at the last second, and then this Mickey roster. Like it was a traumatic and volatile time, and not the kind of stability that I think we're hoping to bring in as an organization, and the stability that's necessary for players to take risks and grow and ultimately thrive. And I think that's something that we're adding in, that regardless of how that roster had performed, if Mickey had been there for a full split or a full year, which he wasn't, I think we're a better environment for those guys to thrive in anyway.
You know, Mickey's nickname in LCK was the Dice.
Yes.
Because people thought he was inconsistent. Do you feel like those inconsistency issues are still around?
I'm sure there's a certain amount of that, for sure. But I also think if you look at some of the teams that he's been on, he was, I think, forced into a position where he had to try to carry often. I think he puts that pressure on himself a fair amount. But also, I think as his team struggled, especially his last year in LCK, which was pretty rough. He's the kind of person that responds to that struggle by trying harder or taking additional risks, rolling the dice, as it were. We're an organization that's pretty risk oriented, or at least risk tolerant, right? Like part of being development focused is that you're putting people in situations where you're not sure that they can handle, and letting them take a risk and supporting them while doing that. So to a certain extent, I think having a risky oriented player is probably good for us and in keeping with our kind of organizational style. That being said, we wanted them to be smart risks or sort of calculated risks. And I think one thing this team will have to figure out as these 5 guys gets in and Tyler starts molding them is where is that line on like where the go button goes, and how much risk do we want to take. I think Mickey is going to be the guy who's saying go and going forward, and I think Matt is going to have to grow into a role where he's the guy saying no and holding back, and we'll let the two of them sort of figure out how aggressive or risky of a style does this team want to have overall.
Definitely. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I don't think so. We're really excited for Summer Split. We went into Spring Split kind of intentionally not setting hard competitive goals, right? It was our first split. It was everybody's first split. We knew this roster was going to take time to gel and that these players were going to need time to grow. And so we didn't go in saying it's playoffs or bust or here we go to the championship or anything like that. We were going to take wins and losses as we got them and try to make sure that we were learning as much as we could the whole time. And while some of that learning as much as we can is going to stay on, we really are setting our sights on playoffs. I think it's good for these guys to have sort of a clear and firm competitive goal that we're shooting for. Whether we make it or not, I don't know. We'll have to play these games out. But I think that is like one of the things, sort of from a top-down standpoint, that we're trying to change for this split. We have a real clear competitive goal. I think we're talented enough to make playoffs. Now it's time for this team to go out and do it.
For more league interviews and analysis, subscribe to our channel. You can also find stats, discussions, and more on our website and mobile app at blitzesports.com.